Welcome to Heroic Mission, where quiet courage, grace under pressure, and the power of presence take center stage. We bring you real and dramatized stories where strength isn't loud but unforgettable. Today's story begins on a luxury yacht, a paradise for the elite. But when a quiet, modest man sits where he shouldn't, one woman tries to make him disappear. What happens next? A silence so powerful it humbles the entire deck. Stay with us and discover why character always speaks louder than status. The ocean didn't crash this far out. It whispered, a quiet murmur brushing the hull of the Celestia like a secret too gentle to shout. The sun had begun its descent into the horizon, bleeding gold and amber across the surface of the Aegean Sea. Light flickered like fire on the water, turning each wave into a brushstroke of molten honey. The Celestia, a super yacht built not for travel but for reverence, carved through the stillness like a silent cathedral at sea. On its highest tier, the Aurora deck, the world looked paused. White linen cabanas drifted lazily in the salt-touched breeze. Crystal glasses glinted on marble tables. Conversations were soft, curated, more breath than voice. This wasn't a cruise. This was a stage, reserved only for the world's most unreachable, people whose surnames owned vineyards, who summered in countries without airports, and who treated silence as luxury. At the center of it all sat Vanessa Moreau, her wrap gown catching the light like liquid sapphire. A vintage champagne, untouched but perfectly positioned, glittered beside a gold tripod holding her phone. She smiled, a calculated, practiced smile, into the lens. Private deck, sunset off the Aegean. 2005 vintage, she cooed, voice silk with vanity. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. Her followers reacted instantly. Fire emojis, heart eyes, digital envy crackling up the screen. This was her kingdom, curated and controlled, down to the shimmer of her earrings. But just then, behind her glass, a shadow moved. A man alone sat quietly at a nearby table, white linen shirt, sleeves rolled, sandals worn with use, tousled hair, no jewelry, no phone, no champagne, just a canvas-bound book resting on his lap. Peri didn't look up. Periha didn't pose, didn't even glance around. He simply existed. And in that moment, everything began to shift. Welcome to The Quiet Man on the Sky Deck, a story of arrogance, silence, and the power of presence. The live stream ended without ceremony. Vanessa Moreau didn't say goodbye, didn't flash her signature wink. She simply tapped the screen and let the curated world dissolve behind a black rectangle. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't care what her followers thought, because someone had disrupted her frame. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, hadn't even tried to look impressive, and yet the man's very presence, unbothered, unpolished, and completely out of sync with the opulence of the Aurora deck, had sent a ripple through her world. She turned her head slightly, her sunglasses catching the dying sunlight like mirrors. He was still there, still seated a few tables away, still reading. He didn't belong here. That was the first thought, automatic, not malicious, just instinctual. The Aurora deck was for the polished, the perfected, the people who had earned this kind of sunset through legacy, wealth, or image. And this man, who wore his shirt as if he'd actually used it, who carried a book instead of a branded clutch, didn't fit. Maybe he was a mistake, a friend of a friend who'd wandered up from the lower deck, a crew member, off duty. Maybe he snuck in, blending just enough into the background to be overlooked. But not by her. Vanessa noticed everything. She leaned back in her chair and lifted one manicured hand with the grace of royalty. A young steward noticed immediately and approached with silent steps. "That man," she said quietly, not even glancing toward him, "do you know who he is?" The steward hesitated, barely perceptibly, but Vanessa caught it, the tiniest flicker of discomfort. "I believe he's a guest, ma'am," the steward replied. "On this deck?" she asked, voice dipped in velvet but sharpened to a point. "I'll check if you'd like." She nodded once. As the steward turned away, the breeze shifted, lifting the hem of her silk scarf like a flag in retreat. Vanessa sat back, repositioning her champagne glass, retilting her shoulders for symmetry. She wasn't angry, not yet, but something had bent, just slightly, out of her control. She looked toward the man again. He had closed his book and was now simply sitting, waiting. Not nervously, not defensively, just patiently. There was no performance in him, no pose. He was the only person on the Aurora deck who didn't seem to care who was watching. And that made Vanessa care even more. Was it confidence, arrogance, or was he just oblivious? Her fingers curled lightly around the stem of her glass. She could feel the eyes of the other guests flicking toward the man and then back again. Everyone else was too polite to say anything. But not Vanessa. She had built her reputation on reading rooms and redefining narratives. She stood. Each step across the deck was deliberate, soft-footed on teak wood. Her heels didn't clack, they whispered, every movement choreographed, intentional. She stopped at the edge of his table and waited. He didn't look up. She cleared her throat. Still nothing. So she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth as honey but threaded with steel. "Are you lost?" He lifted his eyes, slow and steady. They were warm, brown, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone carried no offense, no explanation, just "No," he said simply. Vanessa tilted her head. "This is the Aurora deck," she said. He nodded once. "I know." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's restricted, invitation only." "Understood," he replied. And then nothing. He didn't offer a name, didn't provide a reason, didn't fill the silence with the usual apologies or justifications. He just sat there. Vanessa let out a soft, practiced laugh. It was the sound of someone maintaining control, barely. "Well," she said, her voice still sweet, "enjoy the view." She turned and walked away, slower this time. But her mind was racing. She had dealt with celebrities, CEOs, politicians who wore charm like cologne, but never someone like this, never someone so absolutely unfazed. And that was the problem. He wasn't trying to be anything, and that made her question everything she was trying to project. She sat back down and reached for her phone, but this time, not to stream. He was watching now. Not the sunset, not her followers. Him. There was an etiquette to places like this. An unspoken script written in the tilt of a glass, the length of a pause, the quiet choreography between eye contact and polite detachment. You dressed with intention. You earned your place through taste, grace, and effortless presence. And the man with the book? He hadn't made any effort at all. No tailored linen, no silent nod to legacy brands, no awareness of the subtle theater playing out across the Aurora deck. He simply existed, neither apologizing nor adapting. And that, to Vanessa Moreau, was not just unusual, it was disruptive. She adjusted the folds of her gown. The hem had twisted slightly when she sat back down, and she didn't like how it looked in her peripheral reflection on the gold-rimmed glass. She reached for her phone, but didn't unlock it. Notifications were piling up, messages from followers asking why the stream ended, curious emojis, but none of them knew what had just shifted. Vanessa wasn't streaming anymore. Now she was calculating. 10 minutes passed. The steward still hadn't returned. She looked across the deck again. He was still there. Still not looking at her. Still not performing. And somehow that was worse than if he had stared. Ignoring her was a kind of boldness, intentional or not, that pressed against her carefully built sense of control. The steward returned at last, moving with a mix of caution and composure. "Miss Moreau," he said gently, "the gentleman has been confirmed on the guest list." Vanessa's eyebrow lifted, the gesture subtle but razor-sharp. "Ning." The steward hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, "Mr. Reeves." Something flickered, deep in her memory, like a bell rung across a foggy bay. But she buried it quickly. A sip of champagne, a shift of her scarf, a small, shallow smile. "Thank you," she said. She dismissed him with a nod and he stepped away. But he wasn't the one everyone was now looking at. Not really. Not anymore. Vanessa felt the weight of unspoken attention pressing in around her like seawater against glass. A faint silence had spread across the deck, not uncomfortable, but alert. People were watching now, listening without turning their heads, waiting. And Keanu Reeves? He hadn't moved. He had turned another page in his book. Unhurried, calm, still somehow apart from the atmosphere now revolving around him. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd built her identity in rooms like this, through precision, presence, and perfect timing. She could disarm a panel of billionaires with a single laugh. She once ended a sponsorship contract with a look. But here, now, on the Celestia, her weapons weren't working. He had said nothing, done nothing, and yet the entire Aurora deck had pivoted to him. That wasn't elegance. That was disruption, and Vanessa hated disruptions. She stood again, slower this time, no longer fueled by irritation but by something more insidious, the need to reclaim the moment. Her heels tapped softly against the deck. She approached his table once more and placed a gentle hand on the empty chair across from him. She didn't sit. She didn't ask. She just lingered. "Do you always travel dressed like that?" she asked, not smiling. This time he looked up immediately. His sunglasses were off now, folded and resting beside a small ceramic espresso cup. His eyes were steady, quiet, observing her with the kind of gaze that didn't ask questions. It invited you to question yourself. "Like what?" he replied. She crossed her arms loosely. "Like you're about to help someone move a piano." There was a pause. Then Keanu closed his book gently. No drama, no performance, rested it in his lap and said, "Comfortable isn't a crime." "No," she agreed, "but this isn't a ferry to Crete. This is the Aurora deck." He glanced around, taking in the gold accents, the pressed linen, the curated stillness. "I noticed," he said. Her fingers tapped once on the back of the empty chair. "People here dress with intention. They belong to a certain standard. And you think I don't?" She didn't answer, not directly, but her silence did. He nodded once. "Maybe," he said, "the standard changed." She gave a small, sharp laugh. "Or maybe it was lowered." The words didn't boom. They didn't need to. They lingered, soft as perfume, sharp as smoke. And Keanu, he didn't flinch. He simply studied her, not her makeup or her posture, but the effort beneath it all, the machinery behind the polish. Then he said with almost unbearable softness, "You spend a lot of energy proving you're above people who don't care what you think." Vanessa didn't answer, because for the first time in a very long time, someone had said the truth and didn't flinch when it landed. Silence had once been Vanessa Moreau's greatest weapon. She knew how to wield it, how to pause just long enough to let others unravel, how to smile without speaking until her silence said everything. In negotiations, interviews, dinners with moguls and ministers, her quiet confidence had been mistaken for grace and weaponized accordingly. But not now. Not here. Not with him. Because Keanu Reeves didn't retreat from silence. He lived in it. Vanessa returned to her table, her posture impeccable, her breathing even, but her fingers curled in her lap tapped a slow, uneven rhythm against the fabric of her gown. He hadn't said much, but what he had said, "You spend a lot of energy proving you're above people who don't care what you think." It echoed like a chime struck beneath her ribs, too soft to show, too loud to ignore. The air on the Aurora deck had changed. It was still beautiful. Seared scallops perfumed the breeze, waiters glided like dancers, glasses chimed like wind bells, but something colder now stirred beneath the surface. Eyes no longer drifted lazily across the sea. They hovered. They watched. Not openly, not obviously, but present. Vanessa's silence wasn't power anymore. It was exposure. Then, without meaning to, she moved. Her hand rose, fingers brushing the silver call button mounted subtly above her table. A gentle chime rang out across the deck. It was meant to be discreet. Instead, it cut like a gong through velvet air. Several guests turned their heads, just slightly. A knife paused mid-cut. A phone screen dimmed. A soft shuffle of glances cascaded outward. A new steward arrived, younger than the last. Fresh-faced, clipboard tucked under one arm, name tag slightly askew. He looked nervous, like someone who knew where he was but not yet why he'd been summoned. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked. Vanessa smiled flawlessly. That rehearsed kind of smile, polished, porcelain, impenetrable. "I just wanted to confirm something," she said, voice sugary enough for anyone listening nearby. "That gentleman," she gestured without looking, "may not be in the correct section." The steward blinked, caught off guard. I'm sorry?" "These things happen," she continued with a soft shrug. "Booking errors, last-minute upgrades. It's nobody's fault. I just thought someone should be aware before dinner service begins." It was delivered kindly, professionally, strategically. Keanu didn't move, didn't speak. He reached into the pocket of his shirt, tapped a few times on his phone, then slid it across the table to the steward. The screen glowed. Digital boarding pass. Guest of honor, full access, Aurora deck, booth 7. The steward's eyes widened. He scanned it against the tablet in his hand, then looked up, straightening his back with something between discomfort and resolve. "Mr. Reeves is in the correct seat," he said clearly, voice firmer now. "Guest of honor. Confirmed." Vanessa's lips parted slightly. She laughed, but it wasn't real. It was 2 notes too high, hollow. "Oh," she said, "I see. Well, I just assumed." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The assumption had already spoken for her. The steward gave a tight, polite nod and walked away, but the silence he left behind was heavier now. Not polite, not ambient. Witnessing. Around her, someone adjusted a napkin, a wine glass tilted, a cough was stifled, but no one was truly eating anymore. Vanessa felt it deep in her chest, like a hairline fracture forming beneath polished marble. The spotlight had shifted. She adjusted the silk scarf at her collar, smoothed her dress, recrossed her legs. Across the deck, Keanu Reeves hadn't even looked up. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't do the thing people usually do when proven right in front of a crowd. He just sat, and that made it worse. Because without defiance, there could be no redemption. Without spectacle, there could be no justification. He had disarmed her without ever raising his voice, without ever raising his eyes. And that kind of stillness, that kind of composure, it wasn't ignorance. It was power, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen, the kind that makes people turn to look and question themselves when they do. There was a difference, Vanessa Moreau knew, between elegance and performance. But it was a difference most people never questioned. Because in her world, performance was elegance. You didn't just arrive, you made an entrance. You didn't speak, you delivered. Every look, every gesture, every perfectly timed laugh was a line in a carefully edited highlight reel. And she had been the editor for a very long time. Until now. Until him. Across the polished deck, Keanu Reeves sat exactly as he had from the beginning. One leg crossed, back relaxed, hand resting gently on the book in his lap. He hadn't spoken since the steward confirmed his status. He hadn't glanced her way, hadn't responded to the tension that now bloomed like frost across the teak floorboards. But his silence said everything, and Vanessa hated it. Not because it was rude, he was perfectly composed. Not because it was arrogant, there was no air of superiority around him, but because it made her question the script she'd lived by. She'd spent years sculpting the version of herself that could command rooms like this, that could pull influence out of silence and admiration out of thin air. But this man wasn't playing by the rules. He wasn't even acknowledging there were rules to begin with. And worst of all, it was working. The power she once held in posture and tone was slipping. Not because she'd made a mistake, but because he hadn't needed to make any. She could feel the shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The glances, the hushed glimmers of curiosity, the way someone leaned slightly to whisper behind a linen napkin. People weren't just watching her anymore. They were measuring her. She reached for her wine glass again, but this time it wasn't out of enjoyment. It was to occupy her hands. The stem was cold, damp, slippery. But she didn't drink. This gentleman may not be in the right section. The echo of her voice, captured, possibly recorded, replayed like a distant melody she no longer recognized as her own. Vanessa adjusted her seat, then shifted again. Then, without warning, she stood. Her movements were fluid, elegant, yes, but there was something new now. Something off. The rhythm was there, but the intention had changed. She walked not with command, but with something closer to need. A need to reframe, to reclaim, to remind the room who she was. And so she walked again to his table. Keanu Reeves didn't move. She stopped at his side, not directly facing him, but close enough to speak in a voice meant for 2 people and 30 listeners. "You know what I miss about experiences like these?" she said lightly, eyes on the horizon. He said nothing. She continued. "Elegance, standards, people who knew how to carry themselves, how to respect the space." No answer. She didn't expect one. Now it's just anyone with a credit card and a pair of sandals. The sentence floated between them like smoke, polished, sharp, aimed. And still, he didn't bite. He simply turned a page in his book, one smooth motion. Then, finally, he looked up. Not fast, not provoked, just deliberate. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but when he spoke, the entire Aurora deck seemed to still. "Most people whisper when they don't want to be heard," he said, calm as the sea. He paused. "You, on the other hand, want the world to hear you?" The silence that followed felt like the moment before a wave breaks, soft, suspended, bracing. Then he added, "You're not trying to correct a mistake. You're trying to erase someone who doesn't fit the picture you've created." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed, because in that moment she understood something she hadn't felt in years. Not offense, not humiliation, but exposure. Real, raw, unfiltered exposure. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't humiliated her. He had simply seen her and let everyone else see too. And somehow that was worse, because there was no way to spin it. No elegant exit line, no performance to save the scene. She had come here to own the room, but now she was the only one performing. And he was just reading. The sea didn't rage. It didn't rise up or thunder in protest. It simply kept rolling, smooth, disinterested, eternal. But above it, on the Aurora deck, a different kind of storm had begun to stir. Vanessa Moreau sat at her table like a sculpture carved from satin and pride, still, composed, visible, and unraveling by degrees. She hadn't spoken since Keanu Reeves' words landed, soft as a sigh, sharp as a needle. "You're not correcting a mistake. You're trying to erase someone who doesn't fit the picture you've created." He had gone back to his book. That was the worst part. There had been no final blow, no victorious smirk, no claim to the moral high ground. Just a man returning to his quiet, letting truth settle where words could not. But Vanessa? She felt it, all of it. The silence now wasn't ambient. It wasn't the elegant hush of wealth. It was reactionary, watching, measuring, judging perhaps, or worse, waiting. She glanced around, not with panic, but with calculation. And that's when she saw it. Across the deck, tucked near the glass-paneled edge of the lounge, a young woman in a black jumpsuit sat with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Her phone rested delicately on her lap, screen glowing. Vanessa recognized the expression immediately. She'd seen it in countless fan videos, press events, influencer galas, the look of someone who had captured something they shouldn't have and realized it too late. It hit Vanessa like a ripple becoming a wave. Someone had filmed it. The words, the tone, the attempt to correct what couldn't be corrected. And Keanu's answer, his calm, razor-edge grace, had all the makings of viral gravity. She didn't need to see the footage. She already knew. Her clutch buzzed against her hip. Once, then again in a quick flurry. She didn't check it, not yet. Because denial, temporary as it might be, was still easier than confirmation. She took a slow breath, straightened her back, lifted her chin. Then, again, she reached for the silver button above her table. The chime was softer this time, but somehow it echoed louder than before. Heads didn't just glance, they turned. The attention was no longer passive, it was attentive, expectant. Within moments, a different steward appeared, this one young, bright-eyed, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read, Maya. "Ma'am?" Maya asked, voice light and polite. Vanessa smiled again, but something in it had cracked, a millimeter too tight at the corners, a shimmer of something less than certain behind her eyes. "I just wanted to double-check something," she said, voice low but clear enough to carry. She gestured casually toward Keanu without looking at him. "This gentleman," she said sweetly, "may not be in the right section, a mix-up perhaps, a cabin code error." Her voice was calm, professional, the practiced concern of someone who only wants to help, but the room didn't buy it, not anymore. Maya blinked once, then turned to Keanu. He didn't move, didn't blink. He simply pulled out his phone again, one smooth motion, tapped, slid it forward. The screen glowed once more. Guest of honor, Aurora Deck, full access. Maya scanned the code with her tablet. Then, very gently, she nodded. "Mr. Reeves is in the correct seat," she said. This time her tone was sharper. No apology, no confusion. Finally, Vanessa's mouth opened, then paused. Then, "Oh," she said lightly, a practiced laugh rising from somewhere distant inside her chest. "I see, well, I just assumed." The sentence dropped like a stone into still water. Maya didn't respond. She simply turned, walked away, and didn't look back. And this time the silence that followed was not on Vanessa's side. It wasn't judgmental, it wasn't angry, it was worse. It was aware. The spotlight she had owned so effortlessly, so completely, was now cast elsewhere. And worse, she could feel it slipping with every second of stillness that followed. A knife scraped porcelain in the distance. A glass clinked awkwardly. And yet, the hum of conversation that once glittered across the Aurora deck had dulled to a low, awkward murmur. Not because people were uninterested, but because they were trying too hard to pretend they weren't watching. Vanessa reached for her wine glass again. This time her hand trembled, only slightly. But in a room full of people trained to notice details, slight was enough. Vanessa Moreau had always known how to control the narrative. From red carpets to gala fundraisers, from product launches to private retreats in the Maldives, she'd mastered the unspoken art of managing perception. The right lighting, the right voice, the right expressions. In her hands, a moment wasn't just lived, it was edited in real time. But this wasn't her edit. Her phone buzzed again, long, insistent, then again, and again. A vibration that didn't whisper but screamed. Look, she couldn't. Not yet. She lifted her wine glass instead, took a sip this time. The liquid trembled slightly inside the crystal. Across the deck, Keanu Reeves had not moved. Still seated, still reading, still existing like none of this belonged to him. And maybe that was the power of it. He didn't fight for space. He didn't need to reclaim presence. He just was. And somehow that was louder than anything Vanessa had ever said. She tried to breathe deeply, in through the nose, out through the mouth, center herself, reset. But the pressure wouldn't subside. Not because he had humiliated her, he hadn't. He had done worse. He had made her irrelevant. A few tables over, the young woman in black had stopped pretending to scroll. She was no longer glancing at her phone. Her screen was dark now, lowered still, but her eyes weren't. They were watching. And for the first time, Vanessa saw the difference. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't admiration. It was witnessing. The moment had escaped containment. With trembling fingers, she finally opened her clutch. The clasp clicked softly, too loud in the heavy quiet. Her screen lit up. 17 unread messages. 5 missed calls. 3 voice memos from her assistant. 1 blinking alert from her publicist. And at the top, a message from her niece. "Tell me that's not you." Vanessa's stomach dropped. She opened the text. There it was. A 38-second clip, low resolution but devastatingly clear. Her voice, her posture, the tone. "This gentleman may not be in the correct section." The steward's reply, the screen of Keanu's phone. "Guest of honor." Then the pan to him, sitting quietly, unbothered, the book on his lap, the golden light behind him catching the rim of his glasses and the sea all at once. And the caption. Entitled "Woman Tries to Remove Quiet Man from Luxury Deck. She Doesn't Know Who He Is." Already 32,000 views. Vanessa stared at it. Long, silent. Her world, once perfectly curated, had just been uploaded. And there was no filter, no caption clever enough to save it. Across the deck, someone clicked their tongue softly. Another guest adjusted their seating, casting a not-so-accidental glance her way. The entire Aurora deck felt different now. It was no longer a space of elegance. It was a stage, a theater of discomfort, and she had become the lead character in a drama she never auditioned for. She looked up, and for the first time all evening, she truly saw him. Keanu wasn't looking back. He hadn't looked her way since the second steward left. His expression was unchanged, not amused, not vengeful. Just done. Finished. Whatever conversation might have existed between them had ended not with words, but with his complete absence of reaction. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing to say, nothing prepared, no lines, no salvageable thread, only silence, and the cold realization that for the first time in years, Vanessa Moreau had nothing left to perform. The sea shimmered outside the glass, careless and constant. The Celestia moved forward, unaware that reputations were quietly rewriting themselves on its top deck. And somewhere, just off-screen, a story had already gone global. Vanessa Moreau hadn't moved in nearly 10 minutes. For a woman whose life ran on movement, camera-ready turns, curated gestures, and spontaneous elegance, that stillness was unnatural, dangerous. She sat straight, chin lifted, the image of composure. But beneath the silk gown, beneath the glow of expensive skin cream and legacy jewelry, something had cracked. She was unraveling, not in spectacle, not in sobs or broken sentences, but in microfractures. The way her fingers twitched against her lap, the tightness of her jaw behind a neutral smile, the sip of wine she didn't taste, only performed. The guests hadn't said a word, and that was the point. There was no outrage, no whispers loud enough to address. But the silence wasn't soft anymore. It had weight, and for the first time in her career, not as an influencer, not as a brand, but as a presence, Vanessa realized. She had lost the room. No one confronted her. No one called her out. But everyone knew. The clip had traveled faster than any private yacht. It was already being discussed in hushed texts under the table, reshared in group chats, probably on Reddit threads with GIFs and freeze frames dissecting every expression on her face. She didn't need a press team to tell her that. She felt it. Worse, she saw it, across the deck, in every controlled smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, in every polite turn away that didn't quite turn fast enough, in the woman in the black shawl, who now openly stared, no longer pretending to hide her scream. Vanessa swallowed, her throat dry despite the wine. She reached for her phone again. One more glance, one more denial. The screen lit up like a siren. Clip past 40K views. New alert from publicist. We need to respond now. This is spiraling. Missed call. New message. NY Post has picked it up. And then another text from her niece. No words. Just a meme. Her face. The moment the steward said, "Guest of honor." Captioned. When you try to cancel Keanu Reeves on a boat. Vanessa wanted to scream, but scream would break the illusion. So instead, she smiled again, lifted her wine, crossed her legs the opposite way, adjusted her scarf. Control the frame, she reminded herself. Reclaim the story. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't a frame she could bend. The narrative had already outpaced her. She was no longer writing the scene. She was the scene. Across the deck, Keanu hadn't even looked up. His book lay open, half a page turned, his hand resting on his cup, now half empty. He hadn't spoken since the moment he'd ended the conversation with one quiet truth. And that, Vanessa realized, was the final cut. He hadn't gloated, hadn't made a statement, hadn't said anything, because he didn't need to. And she, who once spun entire careers from a single smile, was suddenly powerless in the face of a man who simply refused to play her game. That's what made it unbearable. Not that he had embarrassed her, but that he hadn't even tried to. That kind of confidence couldn't be taught, couldn't be bought. It was born in silence, refined in dignity, polished in storms far worse than this one. And it made her feel small. Vanessa sat perfectly still, but inside she was screaming. And no one heard her, because now the room wasn't listening for her voice. They were waiting to see what he would do next. But Keanu? He simply turned another page. The Celestia kept gliding. Above the waves, jazz whispered through gold-wired speakers, notes soft as breath. Silverware danced politely across porcelain. The candles flickered with a choreographed grace, casting soft shadows that stretched across the polished teak like questions no one dared to ask. But on the Aurora deck, the stillness was no longer luxury. It was verdict. Vanessa Moreau felt it wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl she couldn't shake off. Everything looked perfect. And yet, something had shifted in the air. The kind of shift you don't notice until it's too late, when a crowd has turned, when a scene has ended, when the silence is no longer pregnant with meaning but heavy with memory. She had been erased, and she knew it. But pride is persistent. Even when cornered, it claws. So she leaned forward ever so slightly and spoke again. Not loudly, not confrontationally, but with a tone she had used for years. Measured, aristocratic, unmistakably performative. "You know," she began, eyes fixed on the sea beyond, "what I miss about these kinds of experiences." Keanu didn't move. "Elegance," she said. "Standards. A time when people knew how to carry themselves, how to respect the space. Now it's just anyone with points on a credit card and a pair of sandals." Her words weren't aimed at him directly. They were cast into the air like a net. A final performance. A last attempt to frame the scene. And yet, he didn't take the bait. He didn't even blink. Until, quietly, gently, he closed his book. Not dramatically, not with punctuation, just finally. And turned his head. Not quickly, deliberately. His voice, when it came, was so soft it felt like it wasn't meant to be heard. And yet everyone heard it. "Most people whisper," he said, "when they don't want to be heard." He looked at her. Truly looked. Not at the scarf, the jewelry, the elegance. At her. "You," he said, "want the world to hear you." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed. It was clear. Fine. "You're not trying to clarify a seating error," he added, voice still calm. "You're trying to erase someone who doesn't fit next to someone like you." Vanessa's arms folded instinctively, defensive. The words stung, but only because they were true. She scoffed. A flicker of bravado, one last scrap of armor. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "I was clarifying a mistake." Keanu studied her a beat longer. Then, in that same tone, "Undeniable, unshakable," he said. "You weren't clarifying. You were erasing." The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They settled. Low, heavy, inescapable. A match dropped onto velvet. No flame, just smoke. Slow, lingered, permanent. And Vanessa opened her mouth, then shut it again. There was nothing to say. Because deep down, she knew. He wasn't wrong. And worse, neither did anyone else think so. He leaned back, opened his book, didn't look her way again. The conversation was over. Not with anger, not with accusation, just with truth. And the silence it left behind? It wasn't empty. It was full, final, undeniably loud. The stars had begun to spill across the sky. The sea was black now, save for where moonlight traced its surface like silver ink. The Celestia glided on, a floating palace cloaked in hush, its engines purring low beneath conversations that never quite found their volume again. On the Aurora deck, candlelight shimmered over half-finished plates and untouched desserts. The hum of dinner had returned, but softer, uneven, like a song that had forgotten its melody. And at the center of it all sat Vanessa Moreau, but still flawless, frozen, the kind of stillness that wasn't elegance anymore. It was containment. She hadn't moved since he closed the book, since he turned his gaze away, since his final words folded the scene shut like the last page of a story she hadn't written. You weren't clarifying, you were erasing. The words echoed not just in her chest but across the deck, in the way no one quite looked at her the same, in the flickers of discomfort around her table, in the subtle, almost imperceptible shift from fascination to calm. She reached once more for her wine glass, but this time her fingers curled around it too tightly. It didn't slip, but something inside her did. Across from her, Keanu Reeves hadn't spoken another word. He hadn't smiled, hadn't gloated, hadn't posted, hadn't streamed. He'd simply sat, and in doing so revealed more truth than any monologue could, because silence, when backed by certainty, was the loudest sound in the world. And for a woman who had spent her life curating attention, the worst punishment wasn't public outrage, it was irrelevance. And that's what his stillness had created. He hadn't taken anything from her. He had simply refused to play the game, and in doing so, made it collapse. The clip online? Viral. The comments? Ruthless. But Keanu hadn't fed the fire. He didn't need to. He had already proven the one thing no brand, no dress, no platform could fake: character. Vanessa closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight behind them. Not tears, just reckoning. She had stepped onto that deck thinking she owned the moment, but it had never been hers. Because class isn't a room you walk into, it's the way you walk through it. And Keanu Reeves? He had walked through with so little effort. It dismantled everything. She looked up one final time. He was still there, sleeves rolled, book in lap, a quiet island in a sea of performance, not trying to be seen, and yet seen by everyone. She didn't speak again that night, and neither did he, because the story was over. And the lesson? It didn't need an ending. Just a pause. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that true dignity needs no microphone, that strength doesn't always speak loudly, and that silence can reveal what words try to hide, then remember this: you don't need to raise your voice to be right. You just need to live in a way that makes others listen, even when you say nothing at all. Thank you for listening to this episode of Heroic Mission. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who believes in quiet strength and character that endures. And remember, not every hero wears a cape. Some just wear sandals, carry a book, and know exactly who they are. If this story left a mark on you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply feel something deeper, then don't let this be the last time we meet. Subscribe to Heroic Mission for more true and dramatized tales, where dignity outshines drama and quiet strength takes center stage. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story, because the moments that truly matter often begin in silence and end with something unforgettable.